Hello class, and welcome to our introduction to the skeleton. So what we're going to try to go over in this week's lecture is the organization, the different roles, human skeletal variation, and axial skeleton. So this resource, getbodysmart.com, is very helpful. I would suggest you guys check it out. And here we go. So the essential questions for this week are, what are the main features of the skeletal system and its functions? How does the skeleton provide for movement? What are the main skeletal elements of body support, organ protection, and postural behavior? So if we were in the lab, we would have you guys do this activity. Unfortunately, we're not, but give the predictions of your height, arm span, and then number 2 would be give me one good reason why we should study human variation. I will put up a discussion board post that you can answer these if you choose. It is not something that is required. However, thinking about why we study human variation is pretty important. So, with human variation, you can understand why someone has a certain defect, what it should look like, and what it does look like, such as, say, sickle cell anemia. Knowing what the blood cell is supposed to look like and being able to identify the sickle in the cell is kind of important. So basically, a regular blood cell, we know, is kind of round. It looks a lot better than my drawing. However, the sickle cell looks like a sickle. So being able to tell the difference between these two is kind of important. Okay, so the division of the skeletal system, we have it divided into 2 separate sections. The axial system, which is basically your core area. It is your skull, the hyoid bone, which is the bone within the neck that is floating, your vertebral column, ribs, and sternum. Next week, we'll look at the appendicular skeletal system. These are the bones that are basically your appendages and what support them. So the pelvic girdle for the lower limbs and the pectoral girdle for the upper extremities. So again, we have for that axial skeleton, the skull, the hyoid bone, which is located right about here, the vertebrae, the sternum, and the ribs. That is what we will be studying today. So, the skull is composed of the cranium and facial bones. The cranial bones are the occipital, which is the one in back, frontal, parietal, ethmoid, temporal, and xiphonoid. The facial is the maxilla, the mandible, vomer, lacrimal, nasal, palatal, zygomatic. So we have the frontal bone, which is the one right up in front. your parietal, and then this is temporal right here, xiphoid bone, and you have the ethmoid bone, which is inside the nose itself, the zygomatic, which is right here, the maximum, and the mandible, and the vomer bone, which is this right here. Again, we have the occipital, which is in the back, the parietal, the temporal, the xiphoid, and the frontal. Okay, those are the only ones that you are expected to know on the top portion. For the bottom, you are looking at the palatin bone, which is that right there, and the foramen magnum. The foramen magnum is where the vertebral column connects and what makes us bipedal. So, the mandible, or the lower portion of your jaw. You want to look at the mandibular condyles, and then you have the coronoid process, which is this right here. Then the mandibular notch, which is right here. Mandibular foramen is right on the inside. And you have the mental foramen, which is that whole. Foramen is whole. You have the ramus, the angle, and the body. So, and for your vertebral column, you have several different types of vertebrae. You have the cervical, which there are 7, the thoracic, 12, lumbar, 5, 1 sacrum, and 1 coccyx. So, an easy way to kind of think about remembering this is 7 a.m. you have breakfast, at noon you typically have lunch, 5 o'clock you typically have supper. The vertebrae get bigger as you traverse down the spine. The top 2 are important and the only 2 that you actually have to remember the names for. However, you will be able to have to tell between the different types of vertebrae. So, an actual vertebrae itself, being able to label it and know what it is kind of important. So we have this beautiful little protrusion is the spinous process. We have our superior articular fossa, the lamina, which is the space in between, the pectoral, which is the space in between here, and between the laminal and the pectoral is the vertebral arch, the body, the vertebral foramen, which again whole, and your transverse processes. So, characteristic features. The one that we are going to talk about now is atlas. Remember that atlas and the axis combine to make it so that your head can turn. This, however, is the only vertebrae period without a body. The body would typically be right about there. The axis, on the other hand, has this beautiful little portion and the dens, which is where it connects. And if you put the axle on it, right here is where it connects, so it can turn. This is another example of the axis. Okay, so you have the superior costal facet, the transverse, and the inferior, which is kind of hard to see on this one. So the thoracic also has a larger spinous process, and the angle is inferior or pointed downward. So this is a very good example of how the process points downward. So for the lumbar vertebrae, there's no transverse forma because your ribs are not connecting to them. So you do not see any. Nothing. No rib facets. It has a more horizontal angle for the spinous process than the thoracic. It also has the largest body because it is at the bottom of your spine. So this is another view of the lumbar, the sacrum, and coccyx. So the sacrum is combined of 5 fused vertebrae. However, it is one item because they are fused. So if I'm asking how many vertebrae, you will put 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 7 lumbar, 1 sacrum, 1 coccyx. Your coccyx or tailbone is the remnants from evolutionary times. Some people still do have extra vertebrae on it that forms a slight tail, but usually it's only 4 fused vertebrae. The hyaloid bone. This kind of looks like vampire teeth. The hyaloid bone is typically stolen when we have class in the fall because of that, but it has these beautiful protrusions right here. It is a floating bone that aids the tongue movement as well as swallowing. So for ribs 2 through 10, this holds true. You have the head of the rib and the inferior and superior articular facets. These are what attach to your vertebrae. You have the neck portion, which is right in here, your tubercle with an articular facet for the transverse process, the angle, the costal groove, the shaft, and the sternal end, where it connects up to your sternum. So for your ribs, you have 7 pairs of true ribs attached to the sternum via a narrow band of costal cartilage, 3 pairs of false ribs, ribs number 8, or pair number 8, 9, and 10, that attach to the costal cartilage via rib 7, not directly attached to the sternum. And then you have 2 pairs of floating ribs. These do not have anterior attachments. Your sternum. Your sternum has 3 parts: the manubrium, which is this top portion right here, the body, and the xiphoid process. Okay, so that's the end of week 1 of bones. I will suggest that you search, Google search, that is, for coloring books. They do have some free coloring pages of the skeletal as well as the muscular system. Hint, hint, it does help. It might sound childish, but it does help. Also, the getbodysmart.com is very helpful. And if you're still having issues, email me and I will see what I can do to help you out. Okay, I will see you guys later. Have a good week and good luck.